trusted and respected.
I've been advised to stand and let you take a photograph.
The family doctor and the ultimate betrayal.
He had a list of 3,000 patients. He had no one looking over his shoulder. It was everything a serial killer might want.
Killing in the community for 27 years.
Harold Shipman thought that he was untouchable.
He thought he could get away with anything.
250 victims.
Just before 4 a.m, the digging began.
But no admission.
Just for the benefit of the tape, Dr. Shipman's eyes are closed and we didn't look at the photograph at all.
In this programme, crucial witnesses, including those who've never spoken before, revealed the whole story. Errors that put him under suspicion.
It could easily have gone a very different way if morphine hadn't been his drug of choice.
The slip-ups that brought the police to his door.
I said to him, I've seen you before you was here this afternoon, and he turned around abruptly.
It was like light bulbs going off around the room.
And the blunders that finally brought his killing frenzy to a stop.
Is it possible for you just to say anything at all? Back into surgery to do my surgery.
He'd been murdering people for many years.
You have said you have nothing to hide, sir.
There's no doubt that if he had not made those mistakes, then he would have carried on killing other people.
Hyde, 7 miles east of Manchester. Joel Lane, a typical street of family homes. But these houses conceal an appalling secret. 6 women who lived under these roofs were all close friends, all good neighbours, and over the course of 4 years, all murdered by the same man, someone they trusted with their lives. Their doctor, Harold Shipman. Halfway along Joel Lane is this attractive cottage. Today it shows no sign of its troubled past. But 21 years ago, this was where Shipman killed his last victim. 22nd of June 1998, Kathleen Grundy was photographed whilst out with friends. Nobody imagined she'd be dead within a couple of days.
Kathleen Grundy was my mother-in-law. Kathleen was incredibly fit. She was far fitter than any normal person of that age would be.
Wednesday, 24th of June, Mrs. Grundy waited at home for her doctor. He'd arranged to call in and take a routine blood sample. She was due to volunteer at a day centre later that morning.
She spent a huge amount of her time helping people in one way or another. She used to semi-organise a club for lunches for old people. A lot of these old people were younger than she was.
But Kathleen Grundy never made it to her lunch club that morning. When 2 friends went to her home to find out why, they found her curled up on the sofa as if she was asleep. They only realised she was dead when they saw her grey complexion. For those who knew her, the death was sad, but not sinister. Mrs. Grundy was 81 after all. But 3 weeks later, her family was sent a mysterious typewritten will, in which she'd supposedly left her entire estate to her doctor, Harold Shipman.
The obvious implication is that maybe Shipman had done something wrong, that Shipman was in some way responsible for this forgery.
The family took their suspicions about the will to the police, who realised that if Harold Shipman had forged it, he also had a motive to kill Kathleen Grundy.
I was the detective in charge of the investigation into Dr. Harold Shipman. I realised that there was something much more sinister than a forged will. I suspected that Kathleen Grundy had been murdered and that Harold Shipman was responsible. The only way that I was going to confirm what had caused her death was by exhuming her body.
When medical experts examined Mrs. Grundy's body, they discovered she hadn't died of natural causes, as Shipman stated on her death certificate. She'd been killed by a massive overdose of diamorphine, the pharmaceutical name for heroin. And the man who'd administered it was Dr. Shipman himself. Before they could arrest him, the word got out.
I was a journalist who broke the Harold Shipman story. I went into Hyde to ask people if they knew Kathleen Grundy if they knew about the case at all. And almost straight away, I bumped into two old ladies. And they said, "Oh, you mean Dr. Death there?" And I said, "Pardon?" And they said, "Oh, yes, we've been calling him that for 2 years. All the old ladies die with him." Once it was in the newspaper, there was a lot more people coming forward. It started off as one death and then quickly escalated into 20. It had a massive impact on the police investigation.
I ran the press office for Greater Manchester Police at the time of the Shipman investigation. We were probably getting about 300 calls a day into the press office. Lots of calls from relatives of people who had died, who were patients of Shipman's. And what those people were seeing when they were watching the media coverage were very similar circumstances to the deaths of their own relatives.
As the names mounted, we were having to write them up on whiteboards in the incident room and having to add more and more whiteboards within a very short space of time.
Police charged Shipman with Kathleen Grundy's murder and started exhuming the bodies of other suspected victims under the glare of the world's media.
Just before 4 a.m, the digging began.
7 times now in Hyde Cemetery, this excavator has uncovered the graves of women who died, according to their death certificates, from natural causes.
Police exhumed the bodies of 3 more patients. That led to the doctor today being accused of 3 further charges of murder.
In total, police exhumed a dozen bodies from cemeteries like this as they tried to discover the true extent of Shipman's crimes.
This was an unusual murder inquiry. Normally, we find a body and investigate to find out who's done it. On this occasion, we had a suspect, and we were then finding the bodies and finding out whether they had been murdered.
He was the ultimate betrayer of trust.
Shipman's marathon killing spree finally ended in 1998. He was put on trial for 15 murders and found guilty of every one.
I led for the prosecution in the trial of Dr. Harold Shipman. Our expectation was that he would admit the killings and put forward some form of psychiatric defense which would allow him to be convicted of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. That evidence, however, was not forthcoming. He chose to deny having killed every one of his victims and accordingly was convicted of murder.
Ruling that he should spend the rest of his days in prison, the judge said he'd acted with a wickedness that defied description.
His trial's now over, but not one of the world's biggest murder investigations. Its primary questions still unanswered.
Shipman was behind bars, but the investigation into his dark history was only beginning.
Just how many patients in the town of Hyde has this doctor killed?
The answer, according to a High Court judge who later investigated, stunned the entire country. He'd killed around 250 patients over 27 years. It made him the most prolific serial killer in Britain, and possibly the world. But incredibly, the death toll would have been even higher had he not made a series of crucial errors.
But for his mistakes, he would have continued killing for an indefinite period.
So what were the mistakes that finally helped the police to stop him in his tracks? Hyde, on the outskirts of Manchester, infamous as the 90s killing ground of GP Harold Shipman. But Shipman's career, both as a doctor and a murderer, began many years earlier.
Hyde, Cheshire. They're treating the same problem.
Qualifying as a doctor in the 70s, Shipman was a respected family GP by the age of 35. So respected, the national media sought his opinions and expertise.
In the past, if a patient had got a mental illness that required admission to hospital, the patient was formally admitted, undressed.
But Shipman was already a cold-blooded killer. He'd murdered around 30 of his patients. As their trusted community GP, he could come and go into their homes as he pleased.
If you can stay in the community, receive your treatment in the community, with your family around you, your usual friends, then this all adds to the speed of recovery from the illness.
10 years passed. Shipman left his group practice and started working on his own, here in the centre of Hyde. At the grand opening, he posed with his oldest and youngest patients. By now, he'd committed 100 murders, and working solo gave him the opportunity to kill even more.
He had a list of 3,000 patients. He had no one looking over his shoulder. He could sign his victims' death certificates and organise a cremation so that he could destroy the evidence. It was everything a serial killer might want.
Over the next few years, Shipman's killing spree became a killing frenzy. He was so confident, he even murdered 5 people in this room, right inside his surgery. In 1995 and 1996, he murdered 30 patients a year. And in 1997, his death toll was 36, 3 victims a month. Shipman considered these the perfect murders, but without realizing it, each one of them contributed to his undoing.
Harold Shipman thought that he was untouchable. However, you can't carry out that many murders without forming some sort of pattern. That was his first mistake.
St. Paul's Church, where many of Shipman's patients worshipped regularly, and where the pattern started to attract attention.
I was the parish priest here in Hyde during the time of the Shipman case. I noticed short time after I came here that I had an unusual number of funerals, and particularly funerals of people who died suddenly. I certainly lost 15, 20 parishioners.
As well as worshipping at this church, those elderly parishioners had something else in common.
I would go to visit a family after somebody had died. It would come up that they were a patient of Dr. Shipman.
Half a mile away, others were observing a similar pattern.
The funeral directors in the area noticed that many of Shipman's patients were dying in the same circumstances. The pattern was that many of these people were being found fully dressed, sitting up. Many of them had got part of a cup of tea sat by the side of them, and it looked to be a sudden event. It was unusual to find people dead in that situation. Quite often, people have had a period of illness, they're in night clothes. But these people were, it was almost as if they were still going about their daily business and had suddenly died. The funeral directors began to talk to other professionals in the town about it.
Those professionals included GPs working in this practice right across the road from Shipman's surgery. They detected the same pattern, but with one additional factor. Many of Shipman's patients were being cremated rather than buried.
Harold Shipman wanted his victims to be cremated because that would mean we couldn't carry out a post-mortem.
But to cremate a body, Shipman had to fill out an official form, and that created a problem.
Harold Shipman had to get a second doctor to sign the cremation form.
I was a GP at the practice across the road from Harold Shipman. He would usually come across to us and ask one of our practice to complete the second part of the form. I still have a recollection of him being at the reception window, quite vivid, really. One of my partners jokingly said, "What are you doing here again? Are you killing them all?" He became quite defensive and almost aggressive. Obviously, in retrospect, maybe he touched a bit of a nerve.
By agreeing to sign the forms, the doctors were, without realising it, helping Shipman get away with murder.
It was only when one of our doctors happened to do 3 within a week that she sort of thought that was slightly unusual. But I look back, we had done 3 times as many cremation forms for Dr. Shipman as we had had total deaths, and our practice had 3 times as many patients as his. I had to double check just to make sure that I wasn't doing something wrong.
The doctors reported their suspicions. Greater Manchester Police launched an investigation. But incredibly, just as it looked like Shipman's carelessness had caught up with him, they took no further action.
It was one officer working alone, covertly, They couldn't let anybody know what he was investigating or who he was investigating, so he was really quite hamstrung.
Unfortunately, that first investigation didn't find any evidence of any wrongdoing. With hindsight, clearly that was a mistake.
I felt relieved that, well, OK, somebody has looked into it and they've found that there's no reason to worry. In retrospect, to me, I don't think they actually fully grasped what we had found and what we were telling them.
The investigation may have reached the wrong conclusion, but it would eventually come back to haunt Shipman. For the moment, he was in the clear, free to kill again and becoming bolder than ever.
It's quite possible that he thought he could get away with anything.
Over the next few months, he killed 3 more patients, and it was while committing the last of those murders that he made another critical mistake. Kathleen Grundy's sudden death on June the 24th, 1998 shocked everyone, including her closest family. Her daughter Angela and son-in-law Phil were equally surprised by her doctor's attitude.
The thing that struck us first was how kind of offhand he was. He just got this strange attitude of trying to tell us how old and infirm she was, which was completely at odds with our experience. He put on the death certificate the reason as old age, and we thought, well, that's crazy. We didn't imagine that he was trying to cover something up. At the time, we somehow believed that he was trying to protect us from the unpleasantness of a post-mortem.
3 weeks later, the family received another shock. A local solicitor's firm got in touch to say Mrs. Grundy had sent them a new will just before she died, in which she left her entire estate to Harold Shipman. Her daughter was especially bewildered, as she was a lawyer and looked after her mother's legal affairs herself.
It wasn't written by the most obvious solicitor, which is Angela, the daughter, who had prepared her will earlier. The content of the will, of course, was also ridiculous. The idea that she would have not wanted Angela and our boys to inherit was hard to imagine.
Their astonishment turned to suspicion when they inspected the document themselves.
I just looked at it and I said, that's not your mother's will. The first thing that struck me was just the fact that it was typed on a not very good typewriter. Kathleen had actually been a professional secretary. The other thing I noticed about the will was that her signature didn't look quite right. And you could see that there was an alignment of the uppercase G in Grundy, which was different. Another detail wasn't right was that it referred to her house, whereas actually Kathleen did own another property.
Although it was Shipman who stood to benefit from the new suspicious will, it never dawned on Mrs. Grundy's family that he was behind it.
My first thought was somebody is trying to set him up, somebody is trying to cause trouble for him. But then I thought, well, we've really got to get to the bottom of this.
The couple went to hide and made a disturbing discovery. They tracked down the 2 witnesses to the will who told them they had signed a document, and the person who had asked them to do so was Harold Shipman.
You could have knocked me over with a feather. I mean, I was so shocked because suddenly a whole series of red lights started flashing in my head.
Now convinced that Shipman was involved, they took their suspicions about the typewritten will to the police, who obtained a warrant to visit his premises.
I sent officers to search Harold Shipman's surgery. One of the things that we were looking for was a typewriter. When they arrived and showed the warrant to Dr. Shipman, he volunteered that he had a typewriter. We sent it off to be analysed. I was in the incident room, sat at my desk, when I get a phone call from the Forensic Science Laboratory to say that they've managed to tie the typewriter that we recovered from Shipman's surgery to the will that had been sent purporting to leave everything to Harold Shipman.
Forensic scientists had discovered that Shipman's typewriter matched the one used to type the new will exactly.
That was a big moment. Particular features of the typewriter, the way that the keys strike the paper, the emphasis that's put onto a letter from the ink. All those things are unique to a typewriter. I realised then that that was a piece of evidence that Dr. Shipman was going to find very difficult to explain away.
Shipman did come up with an explanation, but it was far from convincing.
He told us that Kathleen Grundy had actually borrowed the typewriter. We were very sceptical about that. That didn't hang together, and we just didn't believe him.
Apart from the typewriter, the counterfeit will contained another clue to Shipman's involvement.
The fingerprint people examined the will. They found Shipman's fingerprint on it. If he had nothing to do with forging the will, then why is his fingerprint there?
For the second time, Shipman had brought suspicion upon himself through his own carelessness. But this time, the detective in charge of the investigation wasn't prepared to let him off the hook, especially when he learnt that colleagues had already looked at his possible links to suspicious deaths.
My question was, didn't you have a doctor that you were dealing with only a few months ago that there were some concerns about cremations over? And of course he said, yes, it's the same doctor. Well, that raised my antenna. This moved very quickly from a forgery investigation to a murder investigation. And when I say quickly, I mean within a matter of hours.
Almost as quickly, the investigation widened.
We were investigating on murder Kathleen Grundy. But once we started to look at the deaths from the earlier inquiry, it became apparent that this was going to mushroom very, very quickly.
The police wanted to bring Shipman in for questioning, but before that, they needed proof of how Mrs. Grundy had died. To obtain it, they decided to take drastic action.
He'd put her cause of death as being old age. The only way to find that out was by carrying out an exhumation and carrying out an autopsy. That was a big thing to do because Harold Shipman, not only was he a GP, but he was a respected member of the community as well. But we had no choice.
Officers tried to remove the body from this cemetery without anyone knowing. But the attempt at secrecy failed.
I think the police wanted to keep it quiet a bit longer so they could investigate in relative peace and quiet. However, once it appeared in the newspaper, everybody in town was talking about it.
Dr. Harold Shipman was resolutely working on today, despite being at the centre of a major police inquiry.
There was one day when we were all around the back of the surgery and he actually came out and posed for pictures. He was really snooty and sniffy and long-suffering. Shipman's manner at that point was quite arrogant.
I've been advised to stand and let you take the photograph and then go away. And I'm sure you've had enough time to take a decent photograph.
Quite condescending. I'm the doctor. I'm going to be found innocent and you'll all be very sorry.
Anything at all? Back into surgery to do my surgery.
Despite Shipman's bold and unapologetic front, forensic scientists were examining the body of one of his patients.
Thank you, Doctor.
And soon they would present their results.
At that moment, I knew that Harold Shipman was probably responsible for the murder of Kathleen Grundy.
Hyde, summer 1998. Greater Manchester Police suspected Dr. Harold Shipman had murdered his patient, Kathleen Grundy. But until they could determine the actual cause of her death, he was a free man.
We were unable to arrest Dr. Shipman. We didn't have enough evidence to arrest him.
Incredibly, Shipman was able to carry on working as a GP.
We were worried about the fact that he was still continuing to practice. He'd been murdering patients. There was a possibility that he was continuing to murder patients.
Unaware of the danger they were in, many patients stood by their trusted doctor.
Dr. Shipman has begun offering his patients the option of transferring to another GP, but almost all are staying with him.
My husband is a critically ill person and he's marvellous with him, absolutely marvellous.
But as the doctor carried on, the police were closing in. After exhuming the body of one of his suspected victims from this cemetery, they ordered an autopsy, and the results would expose another of Shipman's mistakes.
I was the pathologist who carried out the autopsy on Kathleen Grundy. After removing the body from the coffin, the external examination was carried out. There was no evidence of physical injury, and there was no evidence of natural disease that could explain death. The only
other explanation is that she might have been injected with or consumed in some other way a poisonous substance. The pathologist sent off samples to be examined at the Forensic Science Laboratory. The toxicologist needed a bit of time to do that, so we were waiting for that result before we could interview Dr. Shipman, because one of the most important things that we would put to a murder suspect is the cause of death.
It was an extremely anxious time for the police, awaiting the toxicology reports, and I well remember asking how long it was going to take.
I was in the incident room late on a Friday afternoon when I received a phone call from the toxicologist. She told me that there were opiates in the body of Kathleen Grundy. The opiate proved to be morphine. The level of morphine in various tissues was quite sufficient to have caused death. At that moment, I knew that Harold Shipman was probably responsible for the murder of Kathleen Grundy.
That's because Shipman had made a crucial blunder.
It was a mistake for Harold Shipman to use morphine, because morphine is relatively easily detectable and it stays around in the body for some time. If he'd used anything else, such as potassium, that would have been lost in the natural potassium levels of the victims' bodies. Insulin would have been difficult to detect at the time. He could have used a short-acting anaesthetic agent, which would have been virtually undetectable at the time. So we were very lucky, in a sense, that he did use morphine.
Getting that news was a huge relief, in the sense that the forensic scientist had said to us when they took the samples, if he's been really stupid, he'll have used morphine.
With their key evidence in the bag, the police could finally make an arrest.
We were told by a contact that Shipman was going to be interviewed at Ashton Police Station on the 7th of September 1998. Shipman arrived with his solicitor and they went for a little walk around all the little streets at the back, obviously having a chat. And we followed them and took photographs. These were the last photographs of Shipman as a free man. He turned around and said, "Go on then, take your pictures." He was clearly irritated by us, but he held his arms out like Jesus on the cross, like he was some victim, and he closed his eyes and rolled his eyes to heaven as if to say, "Yeah, I'm innocent and you're all going to be very sorry when I'm out again." And he walked into the police station and didn't come out. He really believed that he was a doctor and he was untouchable.
There's no doubt that he thought he was going to be going home later that day. Harold Shipman thought that he was going to run the show. He was arrogant. He decided that he was better than the people that were in the room with him, and he thought that he was going to be able to run rings around them. I sent more junior officers to interview him because I thought that that would wrong-foot him.
This interview has been tape recorded. It may be given in evidence if your case is brought to court. The purpose of the tape, could you tell me your full name, please?
Harold Frederick Shipman.
Before long, he came to realise that it was going to be very, very difficult to explain his way around some of the evidence that was being presented to him.
Shipman's biggest difficulty was explaining how the morphine had got into Mrs. Grundy's body. Once again, he had a far-fetched theory. He suggested that his respectable, elderly patient was a drug addict.
I'd wondered very seriously whether this lady was taking drugs other than which I'd prescribed. It's seriously suggested that Mrs. Grundy, a well-respected lady, led a hard, decent life, was inflicted fatal overdose upon herself. Are you really suggesting that to us? I've said that I had my suspicions that she was actually abusing a narcotic of some sort. You tell me that people in Hyde don't have access to drugs. I think you should talk to your drug squad.
The idea that Mrs. Grundy, aged 81 and a former mayoress, was going down to Hyde Market and scoring from her supplier on a regular basis and was a heroin addict was completely ludicrous.
Shipman's excuses may have been implausible, but nobody had seen him arrive at Mrs. Grundy's house or inject her, and he denied everything.
I suggest to you that you have injected Mrs. Grundy with a fatal overdose of morphine.
No.
But even as this interview progressed, police were looking into other suspicious deaths around Hyde, and soon they came across a witness who could tie Shipman to the scene of a crime. Kathleen Grundy's death came 6 weeks after that of another of Shipman's patients. Winifred Mellor was 73 and a widow. She lived on this street, known and loved by all her neighbours.
She was a person who was full of life, always up for a bit of fun, enjoyed a good joke, enjoyed a good party. Just a lovely, beautiful person.
A devout Catholic, Mrs. Mellor had moved to be near the church where she worshipped. But on the 11th of May 1998, she died at her home, entirely unexpectedly. The parish priest called in to comfort her family that evening and soon met a familiar face.
Well, very shortly after I arrived, the doorbell rang. I opened the door and Dr. Shipman, he just breezed past me and went immediately for the 3 daughters, telling them there was no need for a post-mortem or an autopsy because he had seen her and he could sign the death certificate.
Shipman knew exactly how Mrs. Mellor had died, because earlier that afternoon he'd gone to her house and given her a lethal injection. What he didn't realise was that he'd been spotted by a witness now speaking publicly for the first time.
I was Winifred Mellor's friend and neighbour. I was doing my ironing about 3 o'clock and I saw this car pull up and a man come out of the car, come back up the street, past my window, and I heard Mrs. Mellor's gate go because it had a clinky noise. So I just assumed he'd gone into Mrs. Mellor's. He had grey, short hair, a grey beard with a moustache. He had glasses on and he had a maroon car. And that's the man I saw walking past the window. I know it was 3 o'clock because I had to pick the children up from school and I had to leave at 3 o'clock to go there. Came back. I was watching BBC News at 6 o'clock and somebody knocked at the door. And this same man who'd been there in the afternoon was at the door and asked if I had a key for Mrs. Mellor's house. I said to him, I've seen you before you was here this afternoon. And he turned around abruptly. For some reason, I didn't know why. He was annoyed that I'd seen him in the afternoon. We went into the house. Mrs. Mellor was sat up, proper, in the chair, fully dressed, and she just looked like she'd gone to sleep. I stood outside and cried, because I'd never seen anybody dead, and she was a friend, weren't she? A lovely friend.
Mrs. Mellor's neighbour had regarded Shipman as just another GP on a house call, until he suddenly began appearing on the TV news.
A doctor from Hyde in Greater Manchester has appeared before magistrates accused of murdering one of his elderly patients.
I remember it being on telly and the picture of him coming out of his surgery was at the back.
Dr. Shipman filmed recently outside his one-man practice.
And I said, that's him, that went to Mrs. Mellor's. I said, that's his car as well. He was shot, really shot. Because I thought, yeah, it's got to be, hasn't it? He's got to have murdered Mrs. Mellor.
For the police, what the neighbour saw through her window was a breakthrough. For the first time, they could tie Shipman to the scene of a death at the time of death.
Gloria Ellis was a critically important witness. It was very bad news indeed for Shipman that he had been seen there at 3 o'clock because he had obviously entered the home, killed Mrs. Mellor at 3 o'clock, left and came back at 6:30, pretending that he'd simply found her dead in her armchair. This was a loose end of the type that he'd never sought to deal with earlier.
Under interrogation, Shipman got tangled up in his own lies.
Now, you told us you went back to Mrs. Mellor's home when you found her dead.
I went back. You mean I went for the first time to see her dead?
Well, now you're saying it's the first time. Before you said you couldn't remember. Which is it?
Well, you're taking it that it's a repeat visit, and I'm correcting you and saying I can't remember visiting at 3 o'clock. So for me, this is the first visit.
You attended a house at 3 o'clock, and that's when you murdered this lady.
Shipman's mask of arrogance was slipping, and soon it would disappear completely. Next, how the police went back to his surgery and discovered a final and critical mistake.
We went back to the forensic lab at police headquarters with the data we had captured, and it was like light bulbs going off around the room.
September 1998. Harold Shipman was under arrest, suspected of multiple murders. But when he claimed his elderly patients had died naturally, he had supporting evidence.
Shipman thought he had a trump card in that the computerised medical records backed up what he'd put as the cause of death. On the face of it, the medical records seemed to imply that people had been ill for some time.
As far as Winifred Mellor's family was concerned, she was fit and well. But according to Shipman's computer records, she'd been suffering from long-term heart problems.
Dr. Shipman had recorded a cause of death as coronary thrombosis. And if you looked at the medical records, they seemed to back up what he was saying.
Can you tell me how you came to that conclusion exactly, that it was a coronary thrombosis?
We have a history of angina that's of increasing severity.
So you base this conclusion on the history you had of chest pains and anginas?
Yes.
I've got a nasty, suspicious mind, and so I wanted someone to examine the medical records, certainly those that were on the computer, to make sure that what Harold Shipman had put in them was genuine.
That examination would be painstaking. It would also expose Shipman's last mistake and seal his fate.
I was the police computer forensic expert who assisted with the investigation of Harold Shipman. I went to the surgery to take a copy of the computer server and the computer workstations. We went back to the forensic lab at police headquarters with the data we had captured. I started to realise something seriously wrong here.
I remember John Ashley ringing and asking to come and see me.
I went to the murder incident room and sat down with Bernard Postles and his team. There were probably 12 or 15 detectives of different ranks in that meeting.
I knew that when John came to see me, that the information that he was going to give to me was going to be very important.
I started to present my findings. What Shipman was doing was inserting false medical records or altering existing medical records with different information. With Winifred Mellor, those records were basically giving the evidence that she was being treated for angina. Although they appeared to go back 18 months, they were all created within minutes of each other on the same date.
I start saying, well, how does that fit with the information that we've got? What time did Winifred Mellor die? And it's only at that stage when we make that comparison that we realise just how significant it is.
It was like light bulbs were going off around the room. The entries I had found had been created within minutes of each other on the day that the person had been murdered.
Police already knew Winifred Mellor had died around 3 p.m. on May the 11th, 1998. Now they had proof that Shipman faked her medical note shortly afterwards to make it look as if she'd been gravely ill. Further computer analysis showed he'd tampered with records again and again.
He would go to one particular patient, inject them with diamorphine. He'd then rush back to his practice, to his computer, and create the false medical history.
He was so blatant in the way that he altered these medical records that certainly in the case of one patient, he put down the fact that she died before he'd actually been to kill her.
The deceit almost worked, but unbeknown to Shipman, the computer was keeping a record of when he made his entries. So each time he put in false information, he compounded his error.
Basically, he's creating, I am guilty, I am guilty, I am guilty, because he doesn't know that the computer is recording exactly what he's doing and the time he's doing it. Dr. Shipman obviously thought he was laying a red herring false trail for anybody who would look, but that was the biggest mistake he made, trying to cover his tracks.
Confronted with this last piece of damning evidence, Shipman's excuses ran out.
We've got a statement from a Detective Sergeant John Ashley, and what he's found is that there are a number of entries that have been incorrectly placed on this record to falsely mislead and to indicate this woman had a history of angina and chest pains. What have you got to say about that, Doctor?
Nothing.
And so much was your rush to get back. You went back to the surgery and immediately started altering this lady's medical records.
There's no answer.
I think that was when he realised he couldn't lie this away. He'd been caught. The computer doesn't lie. The computer's an inanimate object that records something, and he couldn't answer the question. So in his own mind at that point, he knew he was done.
That was the nearest we ever got to a confession from Dr. Shipman. He asked for a break in the interview.
Can we have a consultation at this stage, please?
Certainly. The time now by my watch is 17:12 hours. I will switch off the tape.
He left the interview room. He broke down. He was on his hands and knees. He was crying. He seemed to be having difficulty breathing. I'd never come across that before in any interview in the years that I'd been a detective.
I wish we'd had computers 20 years earlier, and I knew how to deal with them 20 years earlier, like I did in the late 90s, because we would have saved hundreds of people.
Shipman had given the police little cooperation. From now on, he withdrew it completely.
I think we've already been through the point of you refusing to give us your name and full date of birth.
In a later interview, he turned his back on officers and refused to speak.
I'd like to look at that, just for the benefit of the tape. Dr. Shipman's eyes are closed, and he didn't look at the photograph at all.
Police charged Shipman with the murders of Kathleen Grundy, Winifred Mellor, and 13 other women, as well as the forgery of the will. His trial ended in January 2000, with him being found guilty on all counts.
Each time a verdict was read out, there'd be a small wave of very quiet sobbing or gasps. It just built up. It was so intense, and you could see the pain that these people were in. It was terrible.
Dr. Harold Frederick Shipman, driven away to Strangeways prison tonight, knows he will now spend the rest of his days behind bars.
The trial had taken 3 months, and the verdicts were unanimous. But would Shipman have been arrested and charged at all, but for his own mistakes? If he hadn't created a suspicious pattern, lied to one of his victim's neighbours, forged another victim's will, used a lethal drug that remained in their bodies, and failed to understand his computer system.
I think Shipman's arrogance led to his downfall because he made mistakes that he wasn't even aware he'd made, and never believed that he'd ever be caught anyway.
Had he not forged Mrs. Grundy's will, would he have been able to continue, and if so, for how long?
It could easily have gone a very different way if morphine hadn't been his drug of choice.
I think the computer evidence was the most telling. Had it not existed, I don't know if he would have been convicted.
He'd been murdering people for many years, and there's no doubt that if he had not made those mistakes, then he would have carried on killing other people. One thing we'll never know is why he did it.
Shipman took that secret to the grave, killing himself in his cell in 2004. For the family and friends of victims like Winifred Mellor, his final act only prolonged their pain.
He took the coward's way out by taking his own life. Took the coward's way out. He gave us no explanation of why he'd done it or anything. She wasn't old, she wasn't frail, she wasn't in bad health, and he robbed her of her life. And that's why I hate Dr. Shipman.
Next tonight on Channel 5, disputes spiral out of control and into dangerous territory in The Nightmare Neighbour Next Door.